Welcome to the Artificial Intelligence Podcast with your host, Dr. Tony Huang. Today, I'm with Varun Mohan, who is the CEO of Codium. Varun, can you introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, Tony. Yeah, I'm currently the CEO and co-founder of Codium. We've had a nonlinear path to get to where we are, but excited to have this conversation.
So, Varun, I'm really interested in like how you started up Codium. I've used Codium before in my past, so as a developer on the side, I like to try out different like coding assistants from like GitHub Copilot to Codium. Can you walk through like how you started up Codium and like what your journey looked like?
Yeah, of course. So let me start maybe even the one step before Codium. So I graduated from MIT and ultimately actually worked at this autonomous vehicle company called Neuro. I was there for 3.5 years, led and managed a large team to run large scale deep learning infrastructure offline. And then afterwards, actually started the company in the beginning of 2021. So it's actually been over 3 years. If you actually notice, 3 years is longer than the existence of ChatGPT. So you might be wondering, what were these guys doing at that point? When we actually started the company, we started as a GPU virtualization company. So we built technology to make it significantly faster and more efficient to run GPU workloads. So the idea was, imagine you have workloads that need to run on GPUs. We could run them on CPUs and transparently offload the computation to remote GPUs. We were managing upwards of 10,000 GPUs. The business was doing relatively well given the amount of people we had. We were making a couple million in revenue. But one crazy thing happened in the middle of 2022. Sort of transformers started to become very popular. And transformers, the audience probably knows, are the underlying technology for these generative models. And we believed that actually a large chunk of generative models, or just models in general, were going to be these transformer-based architectures. And in a world in which everyone was going to run transformer models, we thought purely being an infrastructure provider would be a commodity, right? It would be the effect of Tony saying, hey, how cheaply can you run 1,000 tokens of this model? You would say $1, I'd say 50 cents. And we'd go back and forth until no one made any money. But one thing that we deeply believe, though, is that these models would usher in a brand new set of applications, similar to how the internet ushered in the Googles and the Amazons. And we were early adopters of a product called Copilot, and we thought this was just the early innings of what the future of AI for software engineering would look like. And in the middle of 2022, we began actually our journey working on Codium. And I guess one of the unique sort of decisions that we made early on was we would actually go out and train our own models and run them ourselves with our own inference stack. So just some numbers to recap. In the beginning of 2022, we had less than 1,000 users. Now we have over 700,000 users using the product. We process around 150 billion tokens of code every day, putting us in one of the top 5 large generative AI apps in the world. And when developers use Codium, over 45% of all software that is getting committed is actually generated by Codium. And there's a series of reasons why this happens because of us actually having our own models and running the infrastructure ourselves. Now some of the world's largest companies currently use Codium as well.
What was your journey like to start up the company? Did you guys raise money? Walk us through how you grew the company.
Yeah, of course. So I think this is where the story starts to become more, I guess, more nonlinear, right? Most companies that start don't actually end up and I guess successful doing something completely separate. And I guess when we started, we had raised money on the idea of building a GPU virtualization company. So we actually had raised our seed round when we started. And after that, we started actually managing a lot of GPUs. Then after that, raised our Series A, and we had raised $28 million actually working on the GPU virtualization product. And I guess it was an interesting decision for us to actually make the pivot because we had to start all the way back down to zero at that point. And yes, later in 2023, at the very end of 2023, beginning of 2024, we were actually able to raise a Series B from Kleiner Perkins. But the big thing, there was a long period of time, an entire year and a half, where we just needed to rebuild the entire company. That was itself like quite a challenging journey.
So walk us through coding assistants, for instance. That's like the biggest, hottest thing right now in the developer world, where you're using some type of language model in order to help you code. Can you describe the genesis of like where coding assistants came from and where we're at right now?
Yeah, there's one thing that large language models really bring to the table, and that's actually that they are so versatile compared to existing deep learning models, right? If you were to go before large language models, a lot of these models were used for particular tasks, right? And the sort of gamut of tasks that these models were able to solve was a little more limited, right? If you were to go to the autonomous vehicle days, like there would, or those companies in the late 2010s, they would have models to just run detections on images, right? Obviously, you couldn't ask this model like, what is 2 plus 2, or like something about who is the 15th president of the United States. It would not be able to actually tell you this. But the big change that sort of happened with LLMs is just you have the system which doesn't have perfect precision, right? Most people that use ChatGPT would agree ChatGPT is not perfect, but at the same time, it has understanding of a wide variety of things. And this actually ushered in, once LLMs started to become more popular, just this very first product, which is the autocomplete product, which is as the user is typing, very quickly can provide suggestions of what the user will type next, or potentially even like what the right next thing to type is, even if the user didn't know. It'll fill in APIs correspondingly, even if the user didn't know what API to write. And this leverages a couple interesting facts. One interesting fact is that large language models know a lot of things, but also it leverages the fact that if you make a product experience that is very interactive, even though these models are not perfect and hallucinate, you can still make product experiences that people are still willing to use. And I guess autocomplete showed this, but also chat showed this, right? You use ChatGPT. Does it always get the right answer? No, but it's like very confident in not getting the right when it gets the wrong answer also, but it's just fast. So you're able to iterate very quickly. So I think what ended up happening was actually before large language models, there was a series of companies that actually did autocomplete, but the quality bar was just not high enough. Like the acceptance rates of these products were probably in the 10% or sub 10% regime. And that is a point at which it is more of a nuisance to the developer rather than value add. So I think the big change that sort of happened in 2021, 2022 was we got access to these models that could both be run quickly with proper infrastructure. That's a big requirement and could actually get a high enough acceptance rate that it didn't annoy users.
Yeah, I agree. Like the LMs do hallucinate, but it's not going to stop me from using like a chatbot to get my answers, just because of the fact that I get the answers so quickly that I'm able to just peer review the results. So like a human in the loop before I like push that results off to something else. That's the same thing with coding assistants. That I would say GitHub Copilot answers my or like generates code for me roughly like 50 to 70% correct most of the time. And for the rest of the time, I'm just sitting there like trying to fix the code or like iterating through the code. But it's not going to stop me from just because it's getting those answers wrong sometimes, it doesn't stop me from using it because the speed benefit really outweighs like the hallucination that I sometimes get. Are you seeing that from your customers as well?
We are seeing that. So this is a big point here on, and I'm happy to delve a little bit deeper into why we even think we exist, not in terms of like why other people should use the product, but like how do we address some of the issues and shortcomings of these models? So one of the first things is why did we actually go out and actually train our own models? It's actually interesting. One of the big things that Codium can actually do today is actually fill in the middle of a line. So most of the time when a developer writes code, are they writing new code or are they refactoring existing code? So usually refactoring existing code to add new functionality, right? And Codium actually generates suggestions even in the middle of the line. And this meant that we needed to train our models to particularly be able to do that because most of these models that are chat based, are you giving it incomplete chats and expecting it to get the right answer? No, right? That's a completely different data set that only exists when developers are in the middle of writing code. So we've optimized our system at doing that. The second key piece is we are not just focused on looking at open files. We believe to hallucinate less and to generate the most valuable code, we need to leverage the rest of the code base as well. And this is actually a big differentiator for us is that we don't just look at your open files, right? If you store your source code in Bitbucket, GitHub, GitLab, we will actually take the result of that and we've custom made our models also to be able to apply context from arbitrary parts of the code base to be able to deliver the best possible suggestions. And that's why companies actually come to us and why developers actually use the product. It's because of the ability to actually leverage context throughout all data sources. And I think this comes to like a interesting point of these large language models. The fundamental reason why they hallucinate for a large chunk of the like large chunk of cases is because they don't have enough information to complete the task. And code bases are very complex. It's very different than writing marketing material. Because if you look at some of the largest code bases, one of our customers has a singular code base that is 100 million lines of code. And it doesn't matter how much context these models have. Right now, that is a billion tokens of code. That is significantly larger than the largest context window models. And even when we look at the largest context models right now, like Gemini came out with a model that I think is like they are claiming can do millions of tokens of context. Yes, it is good at this task that's called needle in a haystack. And the idea of needle in a haystack is if you put one piece of information inside the context, can it actually retrieve that? But very quickly, if you put five pieces of information and you ask it to retrieve all five, its recall is not perfect. So this is what it's actually solving this problem and making sure that you give people useful information on such a vast amount of code. And code is very interdependent. It's not, you can't just look at a piece of code in isolation, is what we spend a lot of our time doing, making sure our system is very fast too, right? People are not wasting time actually like waiting on suggestions. Because one thing we actually realized is by actually every sort of 10 milliseconds we take longer, developers are less willing to use the product. Right? And I guess the classic example is, let's say you went to the end of 2022 and ChatGPT was 10 times slower. Would it have been nearly as viral as it was at least in 2022?
Gotcha. Yeah, I like the idea of a coding assistant that traverses multiple files so that it can get like a more holistic view of what you're trying to build. Like I know, for instance, whenever I build like Python scripts, for instance, I always have custom Python libraries that I create that I import. And a lot of times, like your run of the mill coding assistant won't be able to see these like custom like import libraries. So it doesn't understand like what that library does other than understand like your basic like NumPy, SciPy, scikit-learn. These are like your basic like libraries that it was already trained upon, but not like these custom codes that you're producing, especially like at an enterprise level where a lot of the stuff is custom.
What you said is exactly right. It's interesting. When you're a hobbyist programmer, actually the number of dependencies you take is fewer. So it's actually an easier job for these systems to zero shot the answer. But the problem is when you have large code bases, actually the complexity comes from the interdependence between the code. And this is why our goal as a company is not just to actually make people faster at writing code. That's actually like not a very interesting goal in my mind. Because if you actually look at most developers at companies or anywhere, they're not spending most of their time writing code. They're spending a lot of time understanding systems, designing systems, reviewing code, debugging code, testing code, deploying code. And there's a classic law in parallel programming. It's called Amdahl's law, right? It says if you take a singular sort of step in a graph of tasks, even if you make that infinitely fast, there's a limit to how much faster that makes the global sort of process. And I'll give you just a simple example here. Let's say there's 100 units of time, and 30 units of time is actually spent writing code. Even if I take the amount of time it spends writing code to zero, we're still left with 70 units of time. So we didn't like fundamentally change the developer experience. And this is why, as a company, we want to be helpful in the navigation of code. We want to be helpful in the reviewing of code, right? Imagine a world in which developers are spending 10 times or can generate 10 times the amount of code. We will still need to review code. I think we are far away from the point at which AI is going to generate code and merge code and then deploy code. Probably there's a lot of hoops to jump through to actually do that, but we want to be the company that actually enables sort of these kind of processes to become 10 times faster end to end.
So I'm curious on like your thoughts on the current trends and the hot stuff that's happening out in the coding assistant world. What's happening right now? Is everyone are like all of the major cloud providers trying to fight for the top spot with like their coding assistant? Like for instance, like GitHub Copilot's trying to get the number one spot. What's going on right now?
Yeah, I think just in terms of quality right now, of all the large vendors, I think Copilot is by far the best quality so far. I think the other cloud providers are coming out with code assistants. We are not seeing people using these products nearly as much. Like Codium has significantly more usage than all of those products right now. There was a recent Stack Overflow survey that came out and actually showcased this and also showed that Codium is by far the most productive and satisfying tool that people spend time using. So I think my viewpoint on this is that this is actually a fairly deep problem. And I think if the hyperscalers want to work on it, they will need to focus on it very deeply. It's maybe similar to how AWS has a product called Redshift. And in theory, Snowflake should not exist. But Snowflake, the data analytics system, does actually exist. And that's because they were just significantly more focused on this. But one of the interesting dynamics I'm seeing playing out is, and I think this is very common to autonomous vehicles, is companies claiming that they can get rid of software developers, right? Actually automate entire software developers out of existence. And I think, look, is that possible in a long enough time horizon? Potentially for some classes of software engineers. Maybe that is actually possible. I think we are far from that right now. I think what we should be focusing on is actually how do we add the most leverage? And we saw this also play out with AV, right? When I started in 2017, actually, funny enough, TechCrunch had an article in 2014 that said this is going to be the year of AV. And in 2024, now they have an article that says, is this the year of AV? And I think this showcases a little bit of tendency of people to overestimate what is possible in a 1 year time horizon and then underestimate what is possible in a 10-year time horizon. If you actually look at the secular trends that have gone by, in 2018, the amount of compute on a consumer grade GPU was 100 times less than the amount in 2022. So what that actually means is the technology curve is improving very quickly. But that also means if you tried to build an autonomous vehicle system in 2018, you would fundamentally have access to different technology than if you started in 2022. So what I think is going to play out is there will be a lot of products that are going to get better and better. But these set of companies that are like, we're going to automate away entire developers, I think it is going to be a challenge, given where the technology is, to completely do this in such a way where in such a way where you're actually able to succeed for a large enough number of tasks. That's what I think is happening right now.
Gotcha. And I've spoken to a lot of developers where they have fear about job displacements due to coding assistance. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I actually think it's going to be completely the opposite. I think there will be more developers, and maybe this is maybe even selfish given we do make money if more developers use our products. But I think I'm just trying to look at empirically. Every time the ability to write software has become easier, actually we've had more developers. And let's say you go from assembly to C++, plus plus, we got way more developers. C++ plus plus to Java, more developers. Java to Python, more developers, right? And I think the actual reason is there's no limit to the amount of technology the world can consume. Whereas for things like, I'll give you an example like farming, there is a limit to the amount of food the world can consume. If we start producing 10 times the amount of food, there needs to be people to consume those calories. Whereas, can you imagine a world in which we say, hey, we're done with technology. Let's just stop. Let's not accelerate technology creation. And I think software is synonymous with creating technology. If you look at the top 10 market cap companies, they are all in some ways software driven companies. So I think what is actually going to happen is if we reduce the barrier to write software and the cost to to create technology goes down, we will get a significantly more number of people that are involved in the technology creation process through software. Now, is the way that they interact with software at a higher level language than even things like Python? Potentially. I think that is possible. But I think that when I look at the largest enterprises and I even go to them, the CIO's first response to Codium is never, I'm going to fire people. The CIO's first response is, I'm going to get more things done. And actually, if I can get more things done, the board slash the company writ large is going to justify more spend in R&D, right? Because that sort of input has become more efficient and is now generating more revenue to the business. So I actually think what is going to happen is a little bit different. I think there will be an explosion in the number of developers in the next 10 to 15 years.
Give me some insider news on what's going on with Codium. Are you guys releasing anything cool that's on the horizon?
Yeah, so I think we will start to release more and more products. I think some products will actually start tackling more parts of the sort of software development lifecycle, not just part of writing code in the IDE. I think because it's what I said, if we only focus on one aspect, we are not going to be able to serve developers in their entire journey of building software. And second of all, also generating more and more software. So right now we have things to refactor singular files very quickly. We have ways to actually autocomplete code. We have ways of chatting with your code base and actually making progress and navigating code bases. But what if we could actually generate code on many files all at once? And we are looking at scalable ways that we could do this and leveraging our infrastructure expertise to do this in a way that is still interactive. Because the worst thing we could do is build ways to modify large amounts of code and then for it to take 30 minutes and for it to be wrong 70 or 80% of the time. So it's actually the form factor of these products matter equally to the underlying technology.
And I have another question for Codium. Can you guys do language to language conversion?
Yes.
So can you take like a legacy language, like something that's very old, for instance, like SAS or Cobalt, and then can you convert it over to either something that's more cloud native, like Python or JavaScript? And then how's that work really?
Yeah. So we can translate code. I want to just maybe like my goal here is to be like very honest. For languages like Cobalt, this is like still a process where we are more of like a multiplier on a developer that is doing that migration themselves. And the reason why I'm saying that is Cobalt was written at a time when object-oriented programming did not exist. So actually the translation is much more complex than a one-to-one translation. If you actually look at Cobalt code, there will be many functions and procedures that look identical, but singular names changed because this notion of polymorphism and common tricks that are used in software engineering were not there. So the most common transformation for Cobalt is actually Cobalt to Java. But this actually requires like globally scoping out the entire code base, finding commonalities, actually refactoring them into classes. So this is like a very complex task. This is not a very simple task actually. But one of the benefits that Codium can do is actually help you like understand the design of your Cobalt code base, understand actually pieces of what these distinct files are doing, and being able to convert singular pieces to Java to actually make sure that the migration is significantly faster. And we have customers that are doing this right now. But I will say this is not a snap of the finger and you automatically can go from COBOL to Java. For some operations, it is actually significantly easier. Let's say I'm trying to go from JavaScript to TypeScript. That is one of the most common ones. Let's say I'm trying to go from one library version to another. That is actually very significantly easier. But another thing actually that we've done, Tony, is we've also made it so that our models are tuned to have particular sort of low frequency languages more prevalent inside our model so that we can actually attack some of the problems regarding COBOL. One of the problems with COBOL on top of that, and I'm sorry for going on a tangent, is actually that COBOL actually, there's more COBOL that lives privately than exists publicly because it's mostly used in commercial contexts, right? Companies that have written the code 40, 50 years ago is where it actually is. So we've actually had a lot of our customers talk to us about how we can help them with COBOL and so on and so forth. But this is not, AI is still not like a magic wand where you point it at something and a whole code base migration is going to happen for these languages.
Gotcha. What about like SAS to Python, where like majority of the code's like SQL, and then you have like a SAS wrapper? Is that does that still have the same problems as like a COBOL to JavaScript conversion?
So that will be significantly easier, actually. This probably at that point, the benefit there is we can actually take a procedure to procedure translation to get us most of the way there for something like that. Yeah, but the problem is, as you astutely called out, for COBOL to Java, actually, it requires the semantic change of the code base to actually be able to do that properly.
And then what about like just library version to library version? Like for instance, if you're on Python and you're using TensorFlow that predates 1.0 and you're trying to switch from 0 point whatever number to 1.0, which has a big code change. Like how do you do that code conversion from a lower version to a higher version of the same library?
So a couple of things that we actually do. So first of all, our system can actually be able to retrieve external documentation. So one of the benefits there is for something like a new version, we can actually have the system hallucinate less and actually be grounded in the realities of what these new libraries are actually capable of. So they're not just hallucinating another version that you didn't really care about. Second of all, actually for something like this is where our very fast refactoring operations is possible. It's actually very easy to go out and point at a file and be like, hey, can you refactor this to use a newer version of this TensorFlow library? And here's the reality of like why code is so complex. Unlike a Google Doc where you can do that, there are implications of other parts of the code where other parts of the code need to be fixed in order for the code to compile, assuming you're writing it in C++, let's say. And obviously, if you're writing in Python, you don't need to compile it, but you'll see the error as you run the code. You can't just have like incorrect code. But you're totally right. Actually, these kinds of migrations end up happening significantly faster with tools like Codium. And one of the big advantages that we've seen there is because we tie it to the existing code bases, we've noticed developers can actually onboard onto code bases close to 4 times faster. Instead of it being 4 to 6 months, it takes 4 to 6 weeks. And this is like true in particular with migrations, where the common thing that companies end up doing is they make every team go out and go and do this migration for a large code base, and that is usually not very effective because actually the amount of like knowledge transfer they need to do for every team to actually properly do this is quite high. It's significantly better to be able to give them a draft of what change should be made. And I think with tools like Codium, this is significantly easier.
Yeah, I agree. It's like using it, this is in my personal life, like using it at work, for instance, in comparison to like doing it the manual route where you're just typing it in. I did notice that I was able to take a year and a half worth of like manual typing using two teams and bring it down to a week with a single developer using like an AI based like coding assistant. There's a lot of gains that I see in using like a coding assistant, especially to just try to be like a force multiplier in order to get to the finish line faster with your solution, to get to production faster. I'm a big champion of using coding assistants, so I'm really excited to see what's next for you guys. Like what's on the horizon for Codium?
Yeah, so I think the biggest one for us is, and this has always been our take here, is like our goal here isn't to be very opinionated. And opinionated not about the product, but opinionated about what technologies our developers and users should be doing. Codium has the best sort of IDE offering on VS Code, JetBrains, all these other spaces. We don't care what cloud provider you use, what source code management tool you use. Our goal here is like, how do we actually leverage all parts of data that a user has access to deliver the best possible product? And then on top of that, actually be in every part of the software development lifecycle, which actually includes this part where you are reviewing code, actually includes the part where you are deploying code. And I think you will see us actually flex to more of these spaces. And I think as a distinction to products like Copilot, where the goal is to sort of increase the sort of depth inside the GitHub ecosystem. For us, we recognize that a large chunk of people are not on there. And for us, like we're innovating like significantly faster, but also available in more places. And I think the big deal is for a company like, and I'm not sure if how you feel about this, for most companies actually migrating off of their tools, if their tools are good, just for the sake of a product like this, is actually largely unnecessary. And for us, we'd like to be able to generate value regardless of where a developer is.
Like speaking of developers, if I was a brand new developer trying to get into the game, like how would I do that using like a coding assistant? What's the first step I would take?
Yeah, so I think it depends on and actually the persona itself matters. So for instance, if you're a senior developer, what we've actually noticed is actually in a lot of cases, senior developers, largely speaking, understand their code quite well, especially if they've been at the company for a while. In which case, they are benefiting a lot from this ability to like very quickly refactor code, very quickly complete their code. And it is actually like accelerating them so they can spend more time on the things that are higher and higher level sort of system design. And we want to like this is the stuff that they want to do in the first place. Whereas for a junior developer, the goal there is like actually using these tools and working with these tools to more deeply understand the code base. I think one of the biggest problems and organizational issues right now that we have is when you take on a new developer, actually the cost of that developer is not only the time it takes to ramp, but all the questions that need to be answered. Not because this person is dumb, but because actually code bases are complex and they've been built over maybe sometimes years, maybe sometimes tens of years. And what ends up happening in these organizations is these people that are fairly senior end up spending most of their time answering questions, reviewing things that are fairly straightforward. And we'd like to just get rid of all this friction in the system, right? And I think actually these tools should be used as ways in which developers can more independently and autonomously be able to do their work, build new applications. And I think that's how these tools should be looked at.
So for your tool for Codium, like how much does it cost for an average developer?
So this is the crazy thing, right? Like for individual developers, the product is entirely free. And this is the gotcha here is not that, hey, look, we're doing this to burn a bunch of money just for the sake of it. The reason why we do it is actually twofold. We believe that our product is not just, we cannot be like an enterprise product. We need to be a product that developers really love in some ways. And we want to be rigorous about the products and features that we roll out. If developers are not using our products, we have failed. And we are very indebted to our sort of individual users to actually be able to validate. And yes, that means that sometimes we ship things that our users say, look, we are not fans of these, but we would like to move very quickly, especially in a space where the space is not very stagnant. And then on the other hand, for enterprises and companies, depending on how you want to run things, we have a variety of options. We can actually run it entirely as a SaaS product in the cloud, and then or we could run it inside your own VPC, depending on the sort of security guarantees. So this is actually a big deal for us, as in the fact that we have great infrastructure enables us to actually deploy this free product at scale, but also enables us to entirely deploy the product inside someone's own VPC and tenant without their code leaving. So it actually serves multiple purposes. And this is where us being this GPU virtualization company in the early days is like actually providing dividends even today.
And then I guess for a privacy question, does the input outputs from the coding assistant, does that get retained for like retraining purposes at all?
Yeah, so for all of the stuff, and first of all, like all of our individual developers, we enable them to opt out like anything that they want to send to us on the code snippet side. We have a strong policy that when we generate suggestions and when we do things like generate autocompletes and all these other things, we will not like train generative models off of like our autocomplete suggestions and stuff like that. So our goal here is like we would like to make it so that the reality of what our individual user base provides us the most value of is largely speaking like a barometer on if our product is getting better. Is our product getting better? Are people preferring some kinds of results over other kinds of results, right? And we'd like to use it as a means of actually shipping better product, right? I think there's already a lot of code out there in the world right now. So I think for us, what matters more is are we building products and are people using the products? And that's why we have such a large individual base. And then obviously for enterprises, we have a variety of security modes. And if it's entirely self-hosted, we see basically nothing.
I see. I see. So basically, you give away the product for free and you allow them to opt out. And then in return, they become like champions within their companies when they're using it during their private time. That's a really great like strategy to get into the enterprise sales. I really like that. So if I was like if I'm like a C-suite listening in on this and I wanted to get in contact with you, what's the best way to get in contact with you?
Yeah, so obviously you could reach out at varun@codium.com. We have a contact page also, and feel free to reach out or feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I think this is like particularly interesting time because tools like generative AI are actually providing this kind of leverage to developers that we've never seen before, right? And in some sense, like every CIO or C-suite executive feels like it is imperative to pick a solution, but also at the same time, the value of these tools, most companies have not invested in actually proving the value of these tools in a very like judicious way. I think we've actually spent a lot of time trying to figure this out and would love to have a conversation, even if the end result is not like, hey, look, we want to use Codium.
And lastly, like last question to wrap this up, what's your prediction on like coding assistants in for the rest of the year in 2024? Do you think that like coding assistants are going to blow up? There's going to be a lot different, more like a lot more vendors that are going to show up with their own coding assistants. What's the landscape going to look like in the future?
Yeah, I think this the space is generating a lot of value, and I think it would be like an incorrect take to assume that there are not going to be more entrants in the space, right? Like usually, if there's a large total addressable market, you are going to get more competitors in the space. Um, I think more than competitors, I think for startups, actually, what matters more is momentum, right? In these scenarios. So I think the more interesting question is like, what new capabilities are going to come out? And I think actually, like, we're going to see the ID experience go through a profound change of how it's going to affect users and their workflows. I think the amount of code that's going to be generated by AI is going to only increase by multiples. And then also at the same time, I think we will see valuable tools actually like outside of the ID as well.
Thanks so much for being on the show. And until next time, stay curious.